The sun hung low over the Arizona territory, painting the barren landscape in shades of rust and gold. In the distance, where the mesa met the endless sky, a lone figure worked beneath the merciless heat. His name was Samuel Whitehawk, though few in the nearby town of Copper Creek knew it. To them, he was simply the Apache, spoken in hushed tones behind saloon doors and general store counters. Samuel drove the pickaxe into the hard earth with mechanical precision, each strike echoing across the empty expanse. Sweat traced dark rivers down his bronze skin, mixing with the red dust that seemed to coat everything in this forsaken corner of the world. He had been at it since dawn, breaking rocks to clear a new patch of land near his homestead. The physical pain was welcome. It drowned out the other kind, the one that lived in his chest like a caged animal. His hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the wooden handle as memories threatened to surface. Maria's laugh, light as spring rain. Little Thomas's first steps across the packed dirt floor of their wickiup. The acrid smell of smoke that morning 3 years ago when the cavalry came. Samuel struck harder, faster, until his muscles screamed in protest. The homestead sat a good 5 miles from Copper Creek, far enough that he could pretend the world ended at his property line. It wasn't much, a small cabin he'd built with his own hands, a lean-to for his horse, a well that ran dry more often than not, but it was his, bought with blood money from his days as an Army scout, back when he'd believed wearing their uniform might make him one of them. He'd been wrong about many things. As the sun began its descent, Samuel finally set down his tools. His movements were deliberate, economical, habits learned from both his Apache mother and his Irish father, though he claimed neither heritage fully. The townspeople saw only the high cheekbones, the black hair he wore longer than fashion dictated, the way he moved through the world like a ghost. They saw Apache, and that was enough to keep their distance. The walk back to his cabin was accompanied by the evening chorus of the desert, rattlesnakes warning from beneath rocks, coyotes beginning their nightly hunt, the whisper of wind through saguaro spines. These sounds were his only companions now, and he preferred it that way. Words were for people who had something worth saying, and Samuel Whitehawk had buried his words with his family. Inside the cabin, everything spoke of solitary existence. A single chair at the rough-hewn table, 1 tin plate, 1 cup, 1 spoon. The bed in the corner, narrow as a grave. On the mantel above the fireplace sat the only decoration, a small wooden horse, carved with painstaking detail. He'd made it for Thomas's 2nd birthday. The boy never got to see it. Samuel prepared his evening meal in silence. Beans, hardtack, water from the ceramic jug. He ate standing up, looking out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, beneath the vast canvas of stars beginning to emerge, lay the burned remains of his former life, the Apache reservation where he'd met Maria, the small valley where they'd made their home. Far from both her people and his father's, the unmarked graves he dug with his bare hands while his tears mixed with their ashes. The town of Copper Creek had been buzzing about him again lately. He'd heard the whispers on his monthly supply run, how he'd gone savage, how he practiced heathen rituals under the full moon, how he was planning revenge against the soldiers. All lies, but Samuel didn't correct them. Fear kept people at a distance, and distance was what he needed. Old Pete at the general store was the only one who'd sell to him without making him wait outside. The grizzled former mountain man would take Samuel's money, fill his order, and send him on his way with nothing more than a nod. It was the closest thing to kindness Samuel had experienced in 3 years. And it was enough. As night fell completely, Samuel performed his evening ritual. He walked the perimeter of his property, checking for signs of intrusion, animal or human. He fed his horse, a sturdy paint mare who'd been with him since his Army days. She nickered softly as he approached, the only creature left who showed him affection. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The words felt strange in his mouth. Some days he wondered if he'd forgotten how to speak entirely. Back inside, he lit a single candle and sat on the edge of his bed. From beneath his pillow, he withdrew a small leather pouch. Inside were 3 items, a lock of Maria's hair, tied with a red thread, a river stone Thomas had given him, smooth and perfect. A photograph, creased and worn, of the three of them taken by a traveling photographer who'd passed through the reservation. Samuel looked at these tokens every night, his own form of prayer. He didn't cry anymore. The tears had dried up long ago, leaving only a hollow ache that never quite faded. Some men turned to whiskey to forget. Others found solace in vengeance or God. Samuel had chosen the slow crucifixion of memory, punishing himself with what he'd lost. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, an owl called, its mournful hoot carrying across the desert. Samuel carefully returned the pouch to its hiding place and lay down fully clothed. Sleep would come eventually, bringing either blessed darkness or the dreams where Maria and Thomas still lived. Tomorrow would bring more rocks to break, more silence to endure, more suspicious glances from townspeople who crossed the street when they saw him coming. It was a kind of death, this existence, but Samuel had decided long ago that it was the one he deserved. A man who couldn't protect his family had no right to live among others. The desert understood this. The desert asked for nothing, forgave nothing, promised nothing. As consciousness faded, Samuel's last thought was the same as every night. Another day survived, another day closer to whenever this purgatory might end. He didn't believe in the Apache spirit world his mother had told him about, nor in the Catholic heaven his father had tried to beat into him. But sometimes, in the space between waking and sleeping, he imagined Maria's voice on the wind, telling him to let go. He never listened. Letting go would mean forgetting, and forgetting would be the final betrayal. So Samuel Whitehawk held tight to his grief, his guilt, and his ghosts, a man entombed in his own silence, waiting for a redemption he didn't believe would come. The morning sun filtered weakly through the grimy window of the boarding house on Copper Creek's Main Street. In the smallest room at the back, a young woman sat perfectly still on the edge of a narrow cot, her hands folded in her lap like broken birds. Her name was Eleanor Hartley, though she'd almost forgotten the sound of it. Her husband called her woman or girl, never anything more. She'd been awake since before dawn, as always, waiting for the heavy footsteps that would signal the start of another day. Frank Hartley slept in the larger room next door, his snores rattling through the thin walls. Eleanor had learned to gauge his mood by the rhythm of his breathing. Steady meant a bearable day, irregular meant trouble. At 22, Eleanor looked a decade older. Her blonde hair, once her mother's pride, hung limp and dull, pulled back in a severe bun that Frank insisted upon. Her dress, a faded brown calico that had seen too many washings, hung loose on her thin frame. She'd stopped looking in mirrors months ago, unable to recognize the hollow-eyed ghost that stared back. The floorboards creaked. Eleanor's spine straightened automatically, her body responding to the threat before her mind could process it. Frank's silhouette filled the doorway, his bulk blocking out what little light there was. "Coffee better be ready," he grunted, scratching his ample belly through his stained undershirt. "Yes, sir," Eleanor whispered, already moving toward the small stove in the corner. Her voice barely rose above a breath. She'd learned that speaking too loudly was considered sass, and sass was met with consequences. Frank Hartley was everything Eleanor's father had warned her about in a husband. Yet he'd been the one to arrange the match. A businessman, her father had called him. A man with prospects. What he really was, Eleanor discovered too late, was a gambler and a drunk who'd lost his stake in California and come to Arizona territory to try again. The marriage had paid off her father's debts. Eleanor was the currency. She prepared his breakfast with practiced efficiency. Eggs fried hard, bacon crisp, bread toasted just shy of burning. Frank liked his routines, and deviation meant punishment. As she worked, Eleanor kept her movements small, contained. She'd learned to take up as little space as possible, to be a shadow in her own life. "Going to the saloon today," Frank announced through a mouthful of eggs. "That new shipment's coming in. Might be late." Eleanor nodded, relief flooding through her like cool water. Days when Frank was gone were days she could breathe. She might even eat something more than the scraps he left behind. "Yes, sir," she murmured again, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. Frank's meaty hand suddenly shot out, grabbing her wrist. Eleanor froze, the coffee pot trembling in her grip. "You ain't thinking of going nowhere, are you?" His eyes, small and mean in his fleshy face, bored into hers. "Remember what happened last time you got ideas?" Eleanor's free hand unconsciously moved to her ribs, where the bruises had finally faded to yellow. "No, sir, I'll be right here." He released her with a grunt, turning back to his meal. Eleanor retreated to her corner, standing with her back against the wall. She'd learned not to sit in his presence unless given permission. It was easier to dodge if she was already standing. The morning dragged on with painful familiarity. Frank finished eating, dressed in his good shirt, the one with only 2 stains, and prepared to leave. Before he did, he performed his daily ritual of reminding Eleanor of her worthlessness. "Look at you," he sneered, buckling his belt. "Skinny as a scarecrow, useless as teats on a boar. Your daddy knew what he was doing, pawning you off. No other man would have you, looking like you do." "You're lucky I keep you at all." Eleanor kept her eyes on the floor, counting the knots in the wooden planks. 17. There were always 17. She'd memorized every imperfection in this prison of a room. "You remember that, girl? You ain't worth nothing to nobody but me, and that's only 'cause I paid for you fair and square." The door slammed behind him, shaking the thin walls. Eleanor remained motionless for a full minute, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Only when she heard the front door of the boarding house close did she allow herself to sink onto the floor. The tears didn't come anymore. Like a well-run dry. She'd exhausted her supply in the first months of marriage. Now there was only a dull, constant ache where hope used to live. She'd believed, once, that someone might love her. Her mother, before the fever took her, used to brush Eleanor's hair and tell her she was special, that God had plans for her. God's plan, apparently, was Frank Hartley. Eleanor forced herself to stand, to begin the daily chores that filled her hours. Washing, mending, cleaning, the repetitive tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind as quiet as possible. She worked in silence, having learned that even humming could be construed as putting on airs. Around midday, her stomach cramped with hunger. Frank had left no food behind today, taking even the heel of bread she'd hoped to save. Eleanor pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the hollow space beneath her ribs. She'd grown used to hunger, wore it like an old companion. The other boarders occasionally left food outside her door. Mrs. Patterson, from 2 doors down, the elderly widow who'd seen too much of life to ignore suffering. But Eleanor couldn't always trust these offerings. Sometimes Frank found them first, and the consequences of taking charity were severe. As afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself at the window, watching the life of Copper Creek pass by below. Women in decent dresses walked arm in arm, laughing. Children played in the dust, their mothers calling them in for supper. Men tipped their hats to ladies, opened doors, offered their arms. It was like watching a play about a world she'd never inhabit. She saw him then, the Apache man everyone whispered about. He moved down the street like a man apart, keeping to the shadows despite the broad daylight. People gave him a wide berth, some even crossing to the other side. Eleanor watched him enter the general store, fascinated by someone even more isolated than herself. What must it be like, she wondered, to be feared instead of pitied, to have people avoid you out of respect for your power rather than disgust at your weakness? She'd heard the stories, that he'd lost his family, that he lived alone in the desert, that he spoke to no one. Eleanor understood that last part. Words were dangerous things. Better to swallow them down until they turned to stone in your throat. The sun was beginning to set when she heard Frank's voice in the street below, loud and slurred. He'd been drinking, which meant tonight would be bad. Eleanor automatically began her preparations, loosening her hair so he'd have something to grab that wouldn't leave visible marks, padding her dress with extra layers that might absorb some blows, practicing the words that sometimes calmed him. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Sir, it won't happen again. Sir." She thought of her mother's grave back in Missouri, of the promises she'd made there before her father hauled her west. "I'll make you proud. Mama, I'll be a good wife, a good woman." The memory tasted like ashes now. Frank's footsteps on the stairs were uneven, punctuated by cursing as he stumbled. Eleanor positioned herself in the center of the room, visible immediately upon entry. Making him search for her only made things worse. The door burst open, and Frank stood swaying in the frame, his face flushed and ugly with drink. "There's my beautiful wife," he slurred, the words dripping with mockery. "My precious, worthless little bird." Eleanor bowed her head. "Welcome home, sir. Would you like some supper?" "What I'd like." Frank stepped forward, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Is a wife who don't embarrass me. You know what they said at the saloon? Said I couldn't control my own woman. Said they seen you watching out the window like some kind of—" His hand moved faster than his words. Eleanor saw it coming but didn't dodge. Dodging made it worse. The blow caught her shoulder, spinning her into the wall. She kept her feet, knowing that falling would invite kicks. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered automatically. "I was only—" "Shut up!" Frank grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his bloodshot eyes. "You don't deserve to speak. You don't deserve nothing. You remember that." Eleanor nodded, the movement difficult with his fingers digging into her jaw. In that moment, she believed him completely. She was worthless, deserved nothing, existed only because he allowed it. The truth of it had been beaten into her so thoroughly that it lived in her bones now, deeper than thought or feeling. "That's right." Frank released her with a shove. "Now get me some food, and don't you dare look out that window again." As Eleanor moved to obey, one thought flickered through her mind like a dying candle. Even shadows needed light to exist, and she was becoming something less than shadow, something that might simply cease to be one day, leaving nothing behind but a whisper of brown calico and 17 knots in a floor. The Saturday market in Copper Creek drew folks from miles around, transforming the dusty Main Street into a river of commerce and gossip. Samuel Whitehawk moved through the crowd like a dark current, people parting before him without conscious thought. He'd come for supplies, flour, salt, ammunition for the coyotes that had been stalking his chickens. The sun beat down mercilessly, typical for late September in the territory. Samuel kept to the shade of the storefronts, his hat pulled low. He'd learned to make himself as invisible as a 6-foot man could be, to conduct his business quickly and return to the safety of solitude. He was examining a sack of beans at Morrison's Dry Goods when the commotion started. "Worthless piece of trash," the voice boomed across the market square. "Can't even carry a simple basket without dropping it." Samuel's hand stilled on the burlap. He knew that voice. Frank Hartley, a man who frequented the saloons and gambling halls, leaving debt and trouble in his wake. Without turning, Samuel could picture the scene unfolding behind him. "I'm sorry, sir. Please, I—" The second voice was barely audible, thin as tissue paper. A woman's voice, threaded with fear. "Sorry. You're always sorry." The crack of flesh against flesh echoed across the square. "Get up! You're embarrassing me!" Samuel turned then, unable to stop himself. 20 feet away, a crowd had formed a loose circle around the spectacle. In the center, a young woman lay sprawled in the dirt. Groceries scattered around her, potatoes rolling away. A precious bag of sugar split open, white granules mixing with the dust. Frank Hartley stood over her, his face red with rage and shame. The woman struggled to rise, her movements hampered by her skirts and what Samuel recognized as the careful way of someone accustomed to pain. Her face was turned down, hidden by a curtain of disheveled blonde hair, but her hands shook as she tried to gather the spilled goods. "Leave it!" Frank's boot came down on her reaching fingers, not hard enough to break bones, but enough to make her cry out. That sugar cost good money, Money wasted on a useless wife who can't walk straight. The crowd murmured, some in disapproval, others in nervous amusement, but no one moved to help. Samuel saw Jake Patterson, the banker, turn away. Mrs. Holloway, the pastor's wife, clutched her basket tighter and hurried past. Even Sheriff Dixon, leaning against a post outside his office, merely watched with calculated disinterest. The woman finally gained her feet, swaying slightly. Now Samuel could see her face, pale, gaunt, with a hollow look of someone who'd forgotten what kindness felt like. A bruise shadowed her left cheekbone, faded to green-yellow. Not from today. Then, look at me when I'm talking to you. Frank grabbed her chin, forcing her head up. You think you deserve sympathy? Think anyone here cares about a worthless... Samuel was moving before he'd made the conscious decision. His boots rang against the packed earth as he crossed the distance, his shadow falling over both Frank and the woman. The crowd fell silent. That's enough, Samuel said. His voice came out rough, unused, but it carried the weight of barely leashed violence. Frank spun around, his grip still cruel on his wife's face. His eyes widened slightly when he saw who had spoken. The Apache, the killer, the man mothers used to frighten children into obedience. This ain't your business. Indian. Frank spat, though Samuel caught the tremor beneath the bravado. This is between me and my property. Property. The word ignited something in Samuel's chest, a flame he'd thought long extinguished. Images flashed unbidden. Maria's body, broken and discarded like refuse, the way the soldiers had laughed, calling her savage property, not worth the bullets they'd wasted. I said enough. Samuel stepped closer, close enough that Frank had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. Let her go. Frank's face cycled through emotions, anger, fear, calculation. The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Frank released his wife with a shove that sent her stumbling. Fine, he sneered. The savage wants to play hero, but she's still mine, bought and paid for. Samuel looked at the woman then. Really looked. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, seeming to shrink inside her threadbare dress. Her eyes, when they briefly met his, held an emptiness that went beyond fear. It was the look of someone who'd given up on salvation. From his pocket, Samuel withdrew a leather pouch. Without counting, he upended it onto the ground at Frank's feet. Gold coins glittered in the dust. More money than most saw in a year. There, Samuel said quietly. Now she's not. The square erupted in whispers. Frank stared at the gold, greed warring with suspicion on his fleshy face. You can't just... he stammered. I just did. Samuel turned to the woman, who hadn't moved, seemed incapable of movement. Can you walk? She nodded minutely, the motion barely visible. Then come. For a long moment, nothing happened. The woman looked from Samuel to Frank to the gold, her mind clearly unable to process this turn of events. Frank made a sound of protest, but Samuel's hand moved to the knife at his belt, a casual gesture that froze everyone in place. I don't, the woman whispered. Choose, Samuel said, still in that quiet, dangerous voice. Him or elsewhere. Choose now. Later, Samuel would wonder what made her take that first step. Desperation, the simple need to be anywhere but where she was, or perhaps some last ember of survival that Frank hadn't managed to extinguish. Whatever the reason, Eleanor Hartley stepped away from her husband and toward the stranger who'd bought her freedom with gold and the promise of violence. Frank sputtered, his face purpling. You can't. She's my wife. There's laws. Take your gold and be grateful. Samuel cut him off. Unless you'd prefer we settle this another way. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Frank's eyes darted to the scattered coins, then to the sheriff, who had developed a sudden interest in the sky. No one would side with Frank Hartley against the Apache killer, not for any woman, certainly not for one so obviously misused. Frank dropped to his knees, scrambling for the coins. Fine, take the worthless baggage. She ain't nothing but a burden anyway. Can't cook, can't clean proper, can't even... Samuel had already turned away, gesturing for the woman to follow. She did, moving like a sleepwalker through the parted crowd. People stared, whispered, pointed, some with pity, some with scandalized delight. Tomorrow this would be the talk of the territory, the day the Apache bought himself a white woman. They walked in silence through the town, Samuel setting a pace the woman could match despite her obvious weakness. He didn't look back to see if she followed. He could hear her labored breathing, the shuffle of her worn boots in the dust. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrubland, Samuel had left his wagon. His horse, patient as always, nickered a greeting. Samuel gestured to the wagon bed. "Climb up." The woman hesitated, looking back toward town. Whatever she saw there, or didn't see, made her decision. With effort, she pulled herself onto the rough planks. Samuel took the reins, and they began the long journey to his homestead. The sun was fierce, but the woman didn't complain, didn't speak at all. She sat hunched in the wagon bed like a broken doll, her arms still wrapped protectively around herself. Miles passed in silence. Samuel's mind churned with questions he didn't want to examine. Why had he intervened? Why spend his gold, Maria's gold, saved for her and Thomas, on a stranger? The woman meant nothing to him. He didn't even know her name, but he knew the look in her eyes, knew what it meant to be reduced to property, to have your humanity stripped away by those who saw you as less than human. He knew, and he'd acted, and now he had no idea what came next. The homestead appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent. Samuel pulled the wagon up to the cabin, set the brake, and climbed down. The woman hadn't moved. "This is it," he said. "There's a lean-to, round back. You can sleep there. There's a well for water. Outhouse behind the hill. You're free to go whenever you want. I won't stop you." She lifted her head then, confusion plain on her face. "I don't... What do you want from me?" "Nothing." The word came out harsher than intended. Samuel softened his tone. "I want nothing. You needed help. Now you have it. That's all. But you paid. Forget the gold." Samuel turned away, unable to bear the lost look in her eyes. It reminded him too much of another face, another time. "There's food in the cabin. Help yourself. I'll be in the barn." He strode away before she could respond, needing distance, needing solitude to understand what he'd just done. Behind him, he heard her climb carefully down from the wagon, heard her tentative footsteps exploring this new, incomprehensible reality. Samuel had thought himself dead to the world, content in his isolation. But today, something had stirred in the ashes of his heart. Not hope, he wouldn't call it that, but perhaps a recognition that there were different kinds of ghosts, and some of them still walked among the living, waiting for someone to see them as human again. The first week passed like a held breath. Eleanor, she'd whispered her name on the third day when he'd asked, kept to the lean-to as if it were a fortress. Samuel maintained his routines, working from dawn to dusk, but now with an acute awareness of another presence on his land. They lived in parallel, two ghosts haunting the same space without touching. Samuel would rise before dawn, kindle the fire in the cabin stove, and set coffee to brew. By the time he returned from feeding the horses, a portion of breakfast would be missing, the only sign she'd been there at all. He began leaving larger portions. Eleanor, for her part, moved through the homestead like a whisper. She found ways to contribute without being seen. Water buckets filled while he worked the far field, kindling stacked neat beside the door, his torn shirt mended and folded on the porch rail. These small acts appeared like offerings from spirits, and Samuel accepted them in the silence they were given. On the 8th morning, he found her at the well, struggling with the heavy bucket. The rope had tangled, and her thin arms shook with the effort of pulling it up. Samuel approached carefully, the way he would a spooked horse. "Let me," he said quietly. Eleanor jerked back as if burned, the rope slipping from her hands. The bucket plummeted back down the shaft with a splash. She pressed herself against the rough stones of the well, eyes wide with familiar terror. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. I was trying to—" "It's all right." Samuel kept his voice low, his movements slow. He reached for the rope, careful not to crowd her. "This well's tricky. Has to be hauled just so," he demonstrated, showing her the angle that prevented tangling. Eleanor watched from a safe distance. Her hands clasped so tight her knuckles showed white through the skin. When the bucket emerged, Samuel set it on the ground between them and stepped back. "There's a smaller bucket in the barn," he said. "Might be easier for you to manage." Eleanor nodded, still not meeting his eyes. She waited until he'd moved away before reaching for the water. Samuel returned to his work, but he felt the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like dust motes in sunlight. Days folded into each other, each one loosening the terrible tension a fraction more. Eleanor began to emerge during daylight, though she still started at sudden movements and loud noises. Samuel learned to announce his presence. A cough, a scrape of boots, anything to keep from startling her. The lean-to, he noticed, had been transformed. What had been a bare shelter now showed signs of habitation. Wildflowers in a cracked jar. The floor swept clean. A quilt she must have pieced together from scraps found in the barn. She was nesting, creating something that belonged to her alone. 2 weeks in, the first real conversation happened. Samuel was repairing the chicken coop when a shadow fell across his work. Eleanor stood there, a basket in her hands. "The hens?" she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I've been collecting the eggs. Is that acceptable?" Samuel sat back on his heels, studying her. In the afternoon light, he could see she'd gained a little weight, though she still looked like a strong wind might carry her off. The bruise on her face had faded completely, but she still held herself like someone expecting a blow. "It's helpful," he said simply. "Thank you." A ghost of expression crossed her face. Surprise, perhaps, at being thanked. She shifted the basket to one arm, seeming to gather courage. "I know about chickens," she offered. "My mother kept them. Back in Missouri, I could tend them, if you'd like." It was the most she'd said at once. Samuel nodded. "They're yours to manage. Then—" Eleanor blinked, as if the concept of having something be hers was foreign. Maybe it was. She turned to go, then paused. "The brown one's been looking poorly," she said. "Might have mites. I could make a dust bath, if you have wood ash to spare. There's plenty. Take what you need." She hurried away. But Samuel caught something in her step that hadn't been there before. Purpose. Maybe. He returned to his repairs with a strange feeling in his chest, like ice beginning to crack on a frozen river. The silent choreography of their shared existence developed its own rhythm. Eleanor took over the chickens completely, and under her care, they began laying more regularly. She started a small garden behind the lean-to, coaxing life from the hard soil with determined patience. Samuel would find small improvements everywhere, gates that no longer squeaked, tools cleaned and organized, the perpetually dusty windows of the cabin somehow clear. He began leaving things for her, a bag of seed he happened to pick up in town, a sturdy pair of work gloves that didn't fit right, a rain barrel positioned conveniently near her garden. Eleanor never commented on these gifts, but they were absorbed into her routine with quiet efficiency. 3 weeks after her arrival, Samuel returned from checking trap lines to find dinner waiting on the cabin's porch, a pot of stew, cornbread wrapped in cloth, even coffee kept warm in the pot. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen, but he knew she'd be watching from somewhere, gauging his reaction. He ate on the porch, making sure she could see him. The food was simple but good, seasoned with wild herbs she must have found. It was the first meal he'd eaten that he hadn't prepared himself in 3 years. The domesticity of it threatened to overwhelm him, and he had to close his eyes against the memory of other dinners, other hands that had fed him. That night, he left his own offering, the rocking chair from inside the cabin, placed on the lean-to's small porch. In the morning, he glimpsed Eleanor sitting in it, watching the sunrise with something that might have been peace on her face. The weather began to turn as October approached. The desert nights grew cold, and Samuel noticed Eleanor's thin shawl was hardly adequate. He'd seen her shivering as she tended the chickens in the early morning. Something would need to be done before winter, but he sensed that offering charity too directly would spook her. Instead, he mentioned casually one evening. They sometimes sat on their respective porches as the sun set, maintaining comfortable distance, that he needed to go to town for supplies. "Anything you need?" he asked, as if it were perfectly normal. Eleanor was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, "Thread, if it's not too dear. The red hen tore a hole in my dress." Samuel made the trip the next day, returning with not just thread but fabric, buttons, needles, everything she might need for mending and more. He also bought a wool blanket, which he left folded outside the lean-to with no comment. October brought the first desert storms, violent affairs that turned the dry washes into temporary rivers. During one such storm, Samuel heard a crash from the direction of the lean-to. Without thinking, he ran out into the driving rain. A section of the lean-to's roof had given way, and Eleanor was struggling to push a heavy beam back into place. Rain had already soaked through everything. Without a word, Samuel shouldered the beam, holding it while Eleanor scrambled to secure it. They worked together in the storm, passing tools and materials back and forth with an efficiency born of necessity. When the makeshift repair was complete, they stood in the rain, both soaked to the skin. Eleanor's hair had come loose from its severe bun, plastered to her face in wet strands. She looked younger, somehow, and terribly vulnerable. "You'll catch your death," Samuel said. "Come to the cabin until this passes." She hesitated, old fears warring with practical need. Thunder crashed overhead, making the decision for her. She followed him at a careful distance. Inside the cabin, Samuel built up the fire and found a blanket for her. They sat on opposite sides of the room, steam rising from their wet clothes, listening to the storm rage outside. It was the first time they'd shared indoor space, and the enforced intimacy made them both cautious. "This roof's sound," Samuel said eventually. "Built it to last?" Eleanor nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. "You built it yourself?" "Every board and nail." She looked around, seeming to see the cabin properly for the first time. Her eyes lingered on the carved horse on the mantel. Something in her expression shifted, a recognition of loss meeting loss. "It's well made," she said simply. They sat in companionable silence as the storm spent itself. When it finally passed, leaving the desert washed clean and smelling of sage, Eleanor rose to go. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time. For everything?" Samuel just nodded, unable to trust his voice. After she left, the cabin felt emptier than it had in years. That night, he lay awake thinking about the simple weight of another person's presence, how it could fill a space without taking anything away. He thought about Eleanor's careful movements, her cautious trust building day by day like her garden, fragile shoots reaching towards sun despite the harsh soil they'd been planted in. Neither of them was healed. Perhaps they never would be. But in their shared silence, in the small kindnesses that passed between them like secrets, something was growing. Not love. That was too large a word for what existed between two people so wounded. But perhaps a recognition that survival could be shared. That loneliness wasn't the only way to honor grief. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, and somewhere in the lean-to, Eleanor would be listening too, wrapped in a wool blanket that asked for nothing in return. It was enough. For now. It was more than either of them had dared hope for. The blizzard came without warning on a December night, sweeping down from the northern mountains like a biblical plague. Samuel had seen the signs, the way the horses huddled together, the eerie stillness in the air, but he'd underestimated the storm's fury. By nightfall, the world had disappeared behind a wall of white. He'd secured the animals and stocked both the cabin and lean-to with firewood. But as the wind howled like a living thing, he found himself standing at the window, looking toward Eleanor's shelter. The lean-to was sound enough for normal weather, but this was no normal weather. A crack like a gunshot split the air, a tree branch, or worse. Samuel grabbed his coat and plunged into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical force, driving ice crystals into his exposed skin. He couldn't see more than a foot ahead, navigating by memory and instinct. The lean-to's door was banging wildly in the wind. Inside. Eleanor huddled in the corner, her lips blue with cold. The small stove had gone out, and snow was already piling in through gaps in the walls. "You need to come to the cabin," Samuel shouted over the storm. Eleanor shook her head. Whether from stubbornness or fear, he couldn't tell. Then he heard it, a thin wail that made his blood freeze. From beneath Eleanor's shawl came the unmistakable cry of a baby. Samuel's world tilted. A baby. How had he not known? But as Eleanor shifted, revealing the infant bundled against her chest, he realized the child couldn't be more than a few weeks old. Born here, in secret, in silence. "Please," Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "She's so cold. I can't get her warm." The plea broke through Samuel's shock. He shed his coat, wrapping it around both mother and child. "Can you walk?" Eleanor struggled to her feet, swaying. Samuel didn't ask permission. He swept both of them into his arms and fought his way back through the blizzard. Eleanor weighed almost nothing, as if grief and hardship had hollowed out her bones. Inside the cabin, warmth hit them like a blessing. Samuel set Eleanor in the chair nearest the fire and immediately began building up the flames. The baby's cries had weakened to whimpers, a sound that terrified him more than the wailing. "How long has she been cold?" he asked, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I don't know." Eleanor's teeth chattered violently. "The stove went out. I couldn't leave her to get more wood." Samuel grabbed every blanket in the cabin, creating a nest near the fire. "Skin to skin," he said, remembering his mother's teachings. "It's the best way to warm her." Eleanor's eyes widened with something like panic, but the baby's labored breathing decided her. With shaking hands, she loosened her dress, pressing the infant against her bare chest and wrapping blankets around them both. Samuel turned away, giving them privacy while he heated water for tea. His mind reeled. A baby. Eleanor's? But the timeline didn't. Unless... His jaw clenched as understanding dawned. The child must have been conceived before he'd found Eleanor at the market. Another cruelty from Frank Hartley. Another burden for a woman already bent to breaking. "What's her name?" he asked softly, still facing away. "Rose." Eleanor's voice was stronger now, the warmth beginning to work. "My mother's name was Rose." Samuel brought the tea, sweetened with the little sugar he had. Eleanor drank gratefully, color slowly returning to her cheeks. Little Rose had stopped whimpering, her breathing evening out. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out without accusation. Only curiosity. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "A bastard child? Another mouth to feed? I thought you'd send us away." "This is your home for as long as you want it," Samuel said firmly. "Both of you." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks. "I tried to manage alone. I've been so careful, keeping her quiet, but the storm—" "You did well," Samuel assured her. "She's beautiful." And she was. As the infant warmed, she opened dark eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the world. A tiny fist escaped the blankets, waving in the air like a greeting. The storm raged for 2 days. 2 days where the normal boundaries of their careful coexistence dissolved by necessity. Samuel slept on the floor, giving Eleanor and Rose the bed. He learned the rhythm of an infant's needs, the different cries for hunger, cold, discomfort. Eleanor, forced by circumstance to accept help, revealed pieces of herself. How she'd hidden the pregnancy from Frank, terrified of his reaction. How she'd given birth alone in the lean-to, biting on leather to keep from screaming. How she'd lived in terror that the baby would cry at the wrong moment and bring disaster. "I named her Rose because roses bloom even in poor soil," Eleanor said on the second night, nursing the baby by firelight. "They're tough. Roses, tougher than they look." Samuel watched from across the room, something ancient and protective stirring in his chest. This wasn't his child, wasn't his family. But the cabin felt less empty with them in it. The ghosts of Maria and Thomas seemed to settle, as if accepting these new souls into the space they'd left behind. On the second night, Rose developed a fever. Her tiny body burned hot, then cold, and her breathing became labored. Eleanor paced the cabin, beyond exhaustion, whispering prayers and pleas. "There's willow bark," Samuel said suddenly. "My mother used it for fevers. But it's in the root cellar." The root cellar was outside, 50 feet from the cabin. In this storm, it might as well have been 50 miles. "I'll hold her," Samuel said. "You rest." "No." Eleanor clutched Rose tighter. "I can't." "You trust me to get the medicine, but not to hold her." His voice was gentle. "Eleanor, you're about to collapse. Let me help." Slowly, as if fighting every instinct, Eleanor placed Rose in Samuel's arms. The baby felt impossibly fragile, like holding a bird. Samuel settled in the rocking chair, the one that used to be on the lean-to porch, and began the slight motion that seemed to soothe infants across all cultures. Eleanor watched for a moment, something unreadable in her eyes. Then exhaustion won, and she curled on the bed, asleep almost instantly. Samuel held Rose and remembered Thomas at this age, the weight of absolute trust in his arms. The baby fussed, and without thinking, Samuel began to hum an old Apache lullaby his mother had sung. The melody rose and fell like wind through canyon walls, wordless but full of meaning. Rose settled, her fever-bright eyes fixed on his face. Samuel talked to her then. Nonsense, mostly, but it seemed to calm them both. He told her about the desert, about survival, about the way the stars looked different in winter. He told her she was safe, that her mother was brave, that the world was hard but not without beauty. When the wind finally died enough for him to venture out, Samuel fought his way to the root cellar. His hands were numb by the time he found the willow bark, but triumph warmed him. Back inside, he prepared the tea with careful measurements, cooling it to the right temperature. Eleanor woke as he was coaxing drops between Rose's lips. Together they worked through the night, taking turns holding the baby, monitoring her fever, willing her to fight. As dawn broke on the third day, 2 miracles occurred. The storm ended, and Rose's fever broke. Eleanor wept with relief, clutching her daughter close. Samuel stood at the window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered desert in shades of pink and gold. "You saved her," Eleanor said softly. "We saved her," Samuel corrected. He turned from the window. "She's strong, like her mother." Eleanor's smile was the first real one he'd seen from her, transformative, like sun after endless rain. No one's ever... She stopped, unable to finish. "It's what people do," Samuel said simply. "They help each other." As the day progressed and the world outside began to dig itself out from under the snow, they worked to restore some normalcy. But something fundamental had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by something warmer, more genuine. That evening, as Eleanor prepared to return to the lean-to, Samuel stopped her. "Stay," he said. "The lean-to needs repairs, and Rose needs warmth. Take the bed. I'll make a place by the fire." Eleanor hesitated. "People will talk. If they knew, let them talk." Samuel's voice carried an edge of the old danger. "Anyone who has something to say can say it to me." So they stayed, not as man and woman, but as 2 wounded souls who'd found themselves responsible for something pure and worth protecting. Rose slept between them, unaware that she'd become a bridge between 2 kinds of grief, 2 different but equally profound losses. That night, Samuel carved while Eleanor sewed, comfortable in shared silence. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time. Inside, the cabin held warmth and life and the quiet miracle of human resilience. It wasn't the family Samuel had lost or the life Eleanor had dreamed of, but it was real, and it was theirs. And for now, that was enough. The snow had melted by the time they made the journey to Copper Creek in late January. Samuel had resisted the trip, but supplies were running low, and Eleanor needed fabric to make proper clothes for Rose, who was growing with startling speed. They took the wagon, Eleanor holding Rose wrapped in the blanket Samuel had bought months ago. The town seemed smaller somehow, meaner. Samuel noticed how people stared, at him, at Eleanor, at the baby. Whispers followed in their wake like dust devils. He kept his face impassive, but his hand stayed close to the knife at his belt. At Morrison's Dry Goods, old Pete greeted them with his usual nod. Eleanor moved through the store with quiet efficiency, selecting what they needed while Rose slept against her chest. Samuel stood by the door, a silent sentinel. They were loading supplies when trouble found them. Well, well. Frank Hartley's voice slithered across the street like oil. If it ain't my wayward wife. Samuel turned slowly. Frank stood with two companions, rough men with the look of drifters. All three had been drinking, though the sun hadn't yet reached its zenith. Frank's face was flushed, his eyes mean. "Not your wife," Samuel said evenly. "Not anymore." Frank laughed, an ugly sound. "That what you think, Apache? You think your gold changed what she is? A man's property stays his property. Legal papers or no." Eleanor had gone rigid beside the wagon, clutching Rose tighter. The baby, sensing distress, began to fuss. "And what's this?" Frank's eyes fixed on the infant. "The savage got himself a half-breed brat already?" His face twisted with something darker. "Or maybe that's my property too." Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Frank and the wagon. "Walk away, Hartley." "Or what?" Frank's hand moved to his hip, where a pistol rode high. "You'll scalp me? Show your true colors?" The street had cleared, townspeople suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. Sheriff Dixon was conspicuously absent from his usual post. Samuel felt the familiar coldness settling over him, the calm that came before violence. "Please," Eleanor's voice, small but clear. "Please don't." Frank's attention shifted to her. "Listen to that. She's begging, just like old times. Eh, woman? You always did beg so pretty." Samuel moved faster than thought. His hand closed on Frank's wrist just as the man reached for his gun, squeezing until bones ground together. Frank yelped, dropping to his knees. "Touch that weapon and I'll feed you to the coyotes piece by piece," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of death. "Look at her again and I'll take your eyes. Speak to her again and I'll take your tongue." Frank's companions backed away, hands raised. They knew death when they saw it, and it was looking at them through Samuel Whitehawk's eyes. "She's with me," Samuel continued, still in that deadly quiet voice. "Not bought, chosen. The child is under my protection. Anyone who threatens them threatens me. Spread the word." He released Frank with a shove that sent him sprawling in the dirt. The man scrambled backward, cradling his wrist, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. "This ain't over," Frank spat. "You can't just, it's over." Samuel's hand rested on his knife. "Unless you want to finish it now. Your choice." Frank struggled to his feet, his companions helping him. They retreated down the street, Frank throwing venomous looks over his shoulder. Samuel watched until they disappeared into the saloon, then turned back to the wagon. Eleanor stood frozen, Rose crying openly now. Her face was pale as parchment, her eyes huge. Samuel gentled his voice. "It's done. He won't bother you again." "You don't know him," Eleanor whispered. "He doesn't forget. He'll do nothing." Samuel helped her into the wagon, his touch careful. Men like that are cowards. They prey on those who can't fight back. Now he knows you can. The ride home was silent, except for Rose's occasional whimpers. Eleanor held the baby close, her knuckles white with tension. Samuel drove steadily, alert for any sign of pursuit. But the road remained empty. As they neared the homestead, Eleanor finally spoke. "What you said, about choosing..." Samuel kept his eyes on the horizon. "I meant it. But you didn't choose. You bought..." I bought your freedom, Samuel corrected. What happened after was choice. You could have run, could have gone anywhere. You chose to stay. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. And you? Did you choose? The question hung between them like morning mist. Samuel thought of that day in the market, of the impulse that had driven him to intervene. He thought of the weeks since, of how the homestead felt less like a tomb with her and Rose in it. Yes, he said simply. I chose. They reached the cabin as the sun began its descent. Samuel tended the horses while Eleanor took Rose inside. When he entered, he found her standing by the window, watching the last light fade. He'll come, she said. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but he'll come. With more men, or with the law, or with... Let him come. Samuel moved to stand beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. This is our home, our land. I've fought for less worthy things. I'm not worth fighting for. The words came out broken, weighted with years of being told exactly that. Samuel turned to face her fully. That's his voice talking, not yours. You're worth 10 of him, 20. You survived him, raised a child alone, found the strength to trust again. You think that makes you worthless? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I brought trouble to your door. You were at peace before. I was dead before. The admission surprised him with its truth. Walking, working, but dead all the same. You and Rose, you reminded me that life goes on, even after loss. That's worth any trouble. Rose chose that moment to voice her opinion, a loud wail that broke the tension. Eleanor moved to tend her, and Samuel built up the fire. As darkness settled over the desert, they fell into their evening routine, Samuel carving while Eleanor nursed the baby. Comfortable silence replacing the fear of the afternoon. Thank you, Eleanor said eventually, for defending us, for claiming us. Samuel looked up from his work, another wooden horse, this one sized for tiny hands. No thanks needed. It's what people do, Eleanor finished with a small smile. They help each other. Later, as Eleanor settled Rose for the night, Samuel stood on the porch, watching the stars. He knew Frank Hartley's type. Wounded pride would fester, possibly drive him to foolishness. Samuel would need to be ready, would need to protect what he'd claimed. The word stopped him cold. Claimed, as if Eleanor and Rose belonged to him now. But that wasn't right. They belonged to themselves, made their own choices. He was just, what, a protector, a provider, a partner, perhaps. The thought felt foreign but not unwelcome. Eleanor joined him on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. They stood together, watching the night, finding comfort in shared vigilance. Will you teach me? Eleanor asked suddenly. Teach you what? To defend myself, to shoot, to fight. I won't be helpless again. Samuel studied her profile in the moonlight, the determined set of her jaw, the steel that had always been there beneath the fear. This was what Frank Hartley had tried to break and failed. This was what deserved protecting, nurturing, honoring. We'll start tomorrow, he agreed. At dawn. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. She turned to go inside, then paused. Samuel, what you said today about me being chosen, did you mean it? He met her eyes directly, letting her see the truth there, every word. Something shifted in her expression, a loosening, like bindings cut free. She didn't smile, but her eyes held warmth as she disappeared inside. Samuel remained on the porch, hand resting on his knife, somewhere in the darkness. Frank Hartley was nursing his wounds and his grudges. Let him come, Samuel thought. Let him try to take what he'd thrown away. He'd find that some things, once chosen, were worth killing for, worth dying for, worth living for. The moon hung full and bright over the desert, casting everything in silver light and sharp shadows. It was the kind of night that made the world seem both larger and smaller, infinite sky above, intimate earth below. Samuel sat on the porch, whittling by feel more than sight, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Eleanor emerged from the cabin, moving with the quiet grace she'd developed over months of sharing space. Rose was finally asleep after a fussy evening of teething. Without asking, Eleanor settled onto the bench beside him, not close enough to touch, but closer than she would have dared even weeks ago. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. The desert breathed around them, alive with small rustlings and distant coyote songs. Samuel set down his carving, a wooden rattle taking shape for Rose. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. "Too much thinking." Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. "Rose will be walking soon, already trying to pull herself up on everything. She's strong, like her mother." He didn't add, but the words hung unspoken between them. Eleanor turned to study his profile in the moonlight. Months of shared days had worn away some of his sharp edges, though the core of flint remained. She'd seen him gentle with Rose, patient with her own fumbling attempts at shooting, generous in 1,000 quiet ways. But tonight, something felt different, heavier. "Samuel," she began, then stopped. The words she needed felt too large for her throat. He waited, patient as the stones. It was one of the things she'd come to treasure, his ability to hold silence without making it a weapon or a wall. "I keep waiting," she finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "For you to realize what a mistake this all is, taking us in, the trouble with Frank, the burden of another mouth to feed, a child that isn't even yours." Samuel's hand stilled. "Eleanor, I don't deserve this." The words tumbled out, sharp with self-loathing. "Don't deserve your kindness, your protection. I'm used goods. Samuel, broken, worthless. Frank told me every day, and he was right. I don't deserve love, not from you, not from anyone." The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of all the words Eleanor had swallowed over years of abuse, all the poison that had seeped into her bones. Samuel could feel the weight of it, the terrible burden of believing yourself unworthy of human kindness. When he spoke, his voice carried the roughness of disuse and old pain. "My wife's name was Maria." Eleanor's breath caught. In all their months together, he'd never spoken of his past beyond the barest hints. "She was Apache, beautiful, fierce, smarter than anyone I knew. Spoke 3 languages, could track better than me, had a laugh that made you believe the world might be good after all." Samuel's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, seeing another time, another place. "Our son was Thomas, 2 years old, just learning to put sentences together. Called me Papa in this voice like bells. The night seemed to hold its breath. Even the coyotes had gone silent. Soldiers came while I was away, said they were clearing out hostiles, making the territory safe. Maria wasn't hostile. She was hanging laundry. Thomas was playing with the wooden horse I'd carved him." Samuel's voice remained steady, but Eleanor could see the toll each word took. "They burned everything. I found them. What was left, 3 days later." Eleanor's hand moved involuntarily, stopping just short of touching his arm. "Samuel, I thought I knew about not deserving." His voice cracked slightly. "What kind of man can't protect his own family? What kind of husband? What kind of father comes home to ashes? I wasn't there. I failed them, failed at the one thing that mattered." He turned to face her then, and Eleanor saw her own pain reflected in his eyes, magnified and aged like whiskey. "I lived with that for 3 years. Told myself I didn't deserve peace, didn't deserve companionship, certainly didn't deserve another chance at happiness. Built these walls, brick by brick, until I couldn't see over them anymore. But you—" "I'm not finished." His voice gentled. "Then I saw a woman being crushed in the street. Saw how the world had convinced her she was nothing. And something in me recognized that lie, because I'd been telling it to myself, too." Samuel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. "Love isn't something you deserve, Eleanor. It's not wages earned or payment for being good enough. Love is given, not earned. It's a gift, freely offered, no worthiness required." Tears tracked silver down Eleanor's cheeks. But You're a woman who survived hell. You're a mother who brought life into this world alone and afraid. You're someone who finds wildflowers in the desert and teaches them to grow. You're worth more than Frank Hartley could count if he had all the gold in California. Eleanor's hand turned in his, fingers intertwining. I don't know how to believe that. I know. Took me months to believe you and Rose weren't just ghosts I'd conjured from wanting. But you're real. This is real. And if two broken people can make something whole between them, isn't that worth more than what we think we deserve? The night wind stirred Eleanor's hair, pulling strands free from her braid. Samuel reached up with his free hand, tucking them behind her ear with infinite gentleness. The gesture broke something in Eleanor. Years of flinching from touch, of expecting pain. A sob escaped her throat. I'm scared, she whispered. Scared of hoping, scared of wanting, scared that I'll wake up and this will all be gone. I'm scared too, Samuel admitted. Every day, scared I'll fail you like I failed them. Scared I'll turn around and you'll have vanished like smoke, but being scared together, that's better than being scared alone. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder. Samuel's arm came around her carefully, as if she might shatter. They sat like that, two wounded souls holding each other up, while the stars continued their ancient dance above. Is this what love is? Eleanor asked into the fabric of his shirt. This terrifying, wonderful, impossible thing. I think so. Samuel's voice rumbled through his chest. At least, this is what it is for us. Love given freely, received with shaking hands. Love despite the ghosts. Because of them. Maybe. Eleanor lifted her head, meeting his eyes in the moonlight. Samuel Whitehawk, I think you might be worth loving. Eleanor Hartley, I know you are. The kiss, when it came, was as gentle as spring rain, tentative, careful, full of promise and pain and hope, all mixed together. It tasted of tears and determination, of second chances and chosen families. When they parted, Eleanor was trembling. I don't know how to do this, she confessed. How to be whatever we're becoming. Neither do I, Samuel said. But Rose needs parents who'll teach her she's worth loving. Maybe we learn by doing. From inside the cabin came a small cry, Rose waking from dreams. Eleanor stood, still holding Samuel's hand. Will you come in? Not for anything more than being there. Just to be a family, sitting together in the dark. Samuel rose, bringing her hand to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that made her breath catch. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. They went inside together, to comfort a child who would grow up knowing she was chosen, was loved, was worth everything two broken people could give and more. The cabin that had held such loneliness now held such life, imperfect, fragile, but undeniably real. Outside, the desert continued its nocturnal symphony. Inside, Samuel held Rose while Eleanor made tea, and they talked quietly of small things and large hopes. Love, they were learning, wasn't about deserving. It was about choosing, again and again, to see worth in each other that the world had tried to erase. It was about being given something precious and saying yes, trembling hands and all. Spring came to the desert like a miracle, painting the harsh landscape in unexpected colors. Purple lupines carpeted the valleys. Golden poppies turned hillsides into flames. And the saguaro cacti crowned themselves with white blooms. The world that had seemed so barren now burst with life, as if the earth itself was celebrating. Samuel stood in the freshly plowed field, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the early hour. The soil, enriched with months of careful composting, was dark and promising. He'd expanded the growing area significantly, planning for 3 mouths instead of 1. The work felt different now, purposeful rather than punishing. Papa Sam! Papa Sam! Rose's voice carried across the morning air, high and sweet as bird song. At nearly 18 months, she'd taken to calling him that naturally, and each time still made his chest tight with emotion. He turned to see her toddling toward him, Eleanor following with a basket balanced on her hip. Rose's sturdy little legs pumped determinedly, her arms outstretched for balance. She wore a tiny dress Eleanor had sewn from fabric bought on their last trip to town, yellow as sunshine, perfect for a desert flower. "Careful, little one," Samuel called, moving to meet her halfway. She launched herself at his legs, wrapping her arms around them with fierce affection. "Up," she demanded imperiously, and Samuel obliged, swinging her high enough to produce delighted squeals. Eleanor reached them, cheeks flushed from the walk in the spring warmth. The haunted look had long since left her eyes, replaced by something that made Samuel's breath catch every time: contentment, maybe even joy. She wore a new dress too, blue as the morning sky. That actually fit her properly restored figure. "Breakfast," she announced, setting the basket down. "Fresh biscuits, honey from the Hendersons' hives, and eggs from our very productive hens." They ate, sitting on a blanket at the field's edge, Rose alternating between feeding herself and attempting to feed the ground. The ritual had become precious, these shared meals under open sky. The three of them together in the quiet morning before the day's work truly began. "Mail came yesterday," Eleanor said, producing an envelope from her pocket. "Mrs. Patterson brought it out specially." Samuel recognized the careful script. Father Miguel from the mission school. He'd written months ago, inquiring about teaching positions, not for himself, but for Eleanor, who'd confessed one night her dream of teaching children to read and write. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the page, widening with each line. They want me to teach the younger children. 3 days a week." She looked up at Samuel, uncertainty clouding her features. "But it's so far. And Rose—" "We'll manage," Samuel said firmly. "You were meant to teach, Eleanor. Anyone can see that. But the house, the garden. We'll be here when you get back. Rose and I can handle ourselves for a few hours." He caught her hand, squeezing gently. "You gave up your dreams once. Not again." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes. "I don't know what I did to deserve—" She caught herself, laughing shakily. "No, that's not right, is it? Love is given, not earned." "Getting wiser every day?" Samuel murmured, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Rose, feeling left out, crawled into Eleanor's lap and patted her mother's wet cheeks. "Mama sad?" "No, sweetheart. Mama's happy, so very happy." They spent the morning working together, Samuel and Eleanor planting seeds, while Rose helped by moving dirt from one pile to another with great concentration. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth and drawing out the scent of sage and creosote. Around midday, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Old Pete from the general store, driving his rickety wagon. Samuel tensed automatically. Unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. But Pete's weathered face split into a grin as he pulled up. "Got something for you, folks," he called, climbing down with effort. From the wagon bed, he produced a rocking horse, carved with obvious care and painted in bright colors. Been working on it all winter. Figured little Rose here might be ready for it. Rose's eyes went round as saucers. She toddled over to investigate, running her small hands over the smooth wood with wonder. "Pete, we can't—" Eleanor began, but the old man waved her off. "Already made, ain't it? Besides, every child needs a horse in this country, even if it don't go nowhere." He winked at Samuel. "Heard you're quite the carver yourself. Maybe we could trade some pieces for store goods, if you're interested." It was more than a business proposition. It was acceptance, community, belonging. Samuel found his throat tight as he shook Pete's hand. "I'd be honored." Pete stayed for coffee, regaling them with town gossip and news from the outside world. Frank Hartley, he mentioned casually, had left for California 2 months back, chasing another get-rich scheme. The relief on Eleanor's face was palpable. After Pete left, they settled Rose for her afternoon nap and worked on their individual projects. Eleanor graded the primers Father Miguel had sent, practicing her teaching voice. Samuel carved at the kitchen table, working on a set of animals for the mission school children. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything golden. Eleanor looked up from her work to watch Samuel's hands shape the wood. Strong, gentle hands that had known violence and tenderness in equal measure. He felt her gaze and glanced up, a question in his eyes. "Just thinking," she said softly, "about how different life can be, how a person can go from darkness to light, from being nothing to being everything." Samuel set down his knife, giving her his full attention. "You were never nothing. I know that now. You taught me." She rose, moving to stand behind his chair, her arms draping around his shoulders. "Samuel, I want to ask you something." He covered her hands with his. "Ask. Would you marry me, properly, legally, before God and everyone?" She rushed on before he could speak. "I know we're already a family. I know papers don't change what we are to each other. But I want the world to know. I want Rose to have your name. I want—" Samuel turned in his chair, pulling her into his lap, kissing her quiet. When they parted, he was smiling, a full, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "Eleanor Hartley, nothing would honor me more than being your husband. Even though I proposed, even though that's not how it's done. We've never done things the usual way. Why start now?" From the bedroom came the sound of Rose waking, calling for them. They went together, finding her standing in her crib, arms raised. Samuel lifted her out while Eleanor smoothed her sleep-mussed hair. "We're getting married, little flower." Eleanor told her daughter, "Would you like that? For Papa Sam to really be your papa?" Rose's response was to pat Samuel's cheek and announce, "Papa," with great certainty, as if the matter had long been settled in her mind. They spent the evening on the porch, Samuel carving while Eleanor read aloud from a book of stories. Rose played with her new rocking horse, making it gallop across the porch boards with appropriate sound effects. The spring air carried the scent of Eleanor's flowering garden, the roses she'd coaxed from cuttings blooming in defiance of the desert climate. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they prepared for bed with the easy rhythm of long practice. Rose insisted on her bedtime story from Samuel, who obliged with a tale of a brave little girl who could talk to horses and ravens. Eleanor watched from the doorway, her heart so full it ached. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Samuel voiced what they both were thinking. "Never thought I'd have this again, a family, a future, hope." "Neither did I." Eleanor traced patterns on his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady under her palm. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real." "It's real." He caught her hand, brought it to his lips. "We're real. This life we're building, it's real and it's ours." Outside, a mockingbird began its nocturnal concert, running through its repertoire of borrowed songs. Inside, Rose slept peacefully in her crib, dreaming whatever dreams came to children who'd never known anything but love. And in their bed, two people who'd thought themselves beyond saving held each other close, proof that sometimes the broken pieces of different lives could fit together to make something whole and beautiful and worth every struggle to achieve. Spring in the desert was brief but glorious, and so they were learning. Could be second chances. Love, freely given and gratefully received, bloomed like the roses in Eleanor's garden, against all odds, despite the harsh conditions, more beautiful for having survived. The wooden horse on the mantel no longer stood alone. Beside it now sat other carvings, a bird in flight, a mother holding a child, a family of 3 standing together. Not a shrine to loss anymore, but a celebration of life continuing, love enduring, hope restored. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of romance and redemption in the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Samuel and Eleanor's journey in the comments. What touched your heart the most?